Hi there, we're going to get started in a minute. I'm just figuring out how to go on Facebook Live, which is not my natural, strength here. So just give me a minute.
Hey, Sara. So nice to see you.
Hi. So nice to see you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't see you for some. Most of the time we'll be driving soon. I'm gonna be, but
No problem.
here. Thank you.
Okay, hold on. Let me pin video and now share screen. Here we go. Okay, can you guys see the source sheet?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, let me just make sure it's also working here. Hopefully it is. Just a second. Awesome. Okay. It is. Can you guys see the source sheet?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, let me just make sure it's also 1 second working. Hopefully this one is working. And if not, I'll find out later. Okay. If you are joining me on Facebook, I'm not going to see any comments while I'm teaching, so I apologize about that. Wait, I just lost my Zoom people. Here we go.
No, you're not. We're here.
There we see you now. Okay.
I saw another option to go, not in Zoom.
It's on Facebook Live. I'm trying to stream it to Facebook Live, but I don't even know if it's working or not. Hold on, there. Just
check. I can check. You want me?
It's okay. Either way, we'll just get started. Let me just find my source sheet. There we go. Okay. So I'm really excited you guys are here. I miss learning in person. I hope that's something that we can do soon, because I find that over Zoom, no one really, shares their comments in the same way that we do when we're sitting around the table in the library at shul. And that's a big part of the learning, I think, for me, is like hearing other people's ideas. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to add things in the chat and I will take a look at them periodically. And if not, then, that's okay too. And if anybody has any thoughts that they want to share, sort of later on, feel free to send them my way. We can talk about them next week. The way I broke down this series is that this week we are going to be discussing the first day of Rosh Hashanah's Torah reading. Next week we'll do the second day. And then the third week we will do both Haftorahs, which might be a little ambitious, but I think it'll be okay to just cover them a little bit more briefly. And we will then be out of time because Rosh Hashanah starts the following evening. So whether we like it or not, we need to do them in 1 week. So before we sort of get into what I really want to talk about today, I think that it's important for us to see the Torah reading in front of us. So I did put it all here on the source sheet, which, as you see, there is a lot. It's not actually so long compared to a regular Shabbos Torah reading, but there is a lot there. We're not going to read all of it inside today, but I do encourage you, if you can find the time before Rosh Hashanah. I know there are lots of preparations that we should all be doing, but do take the time to look it over and just have a sense of what's going to be going on, whether you'll be in shul this year or not in shul. It's worth learning it more in depth, and maybe choose one commentary to go through it with. That can be really helpful. But basically, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the chapter of Chaf Aleph of Bereshis, and it has 3 major sort of episodes that take place. The first sort of leads into the next. The first is the birth of Yitzhak, which I would say is the most sort of popular reason why we understand this to be the reading for Rosh Hashanah, which is that, generally it's always quoted that we have this tradition that on Rosh Hashanah is when various women were remembered for their infertility, and that at that moment is when Hashem remembered them and decided to give them a child. It doesn't mean they got pregnant that day, but it means that they were remembered. So Sara is one of those women, possibly Rachel, Chana. There's different midrashim that have different sort of names that they list there. Sometimes they say it's both Sara and Abraham who remembered on this day, but that is sort of like, I would say, the most popular reason I've found for why we read this chapter on Rosh Hashanah. Now, the reason why that's kind of unsettling to me, I guess, is if you look here, it only goes up to verse 8, Pasuk Chet. And then already in Pasuk Tet, verse 9, we're on to a new story that has nothing to do anymore with Sarah being remembered and having a child. And then even after that whole thing is over, maybe you could argue that the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael is related to the birth of Yitzhak, because Yitzhak was born and he, that led to Sarah's recognition that Ishmael was a bad influence and that he wasn't going to be the one to carry on the tradition and sort of carry on the next generation of the Jewish people. And so Ishmael had to leave. So maybe you could argue that ties in. Okay. And then you get to the third section, and it's this random sort of story of Avimelech coming to Abraham and asking him for a multi-generational peace treaty. So we will get to that a little later on and discuss what was going on there a little bit. But it just seems to me like they could have easily said, okay, we're going to read from verse 1 to 21, Aleph to Chaf Aleph, and then we're going to stop. And tomorrow we'll read the story of the Akedah. Now, next week we will discuss a little bit more why the Akedah Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, is the topic for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. But I think that it's sort of interesting to me. I've always sort of wondered, what is the context? Why do we care about this random story with Avimelech? Why is he part of our sort of Rosh Hashanah Torah study, essentially? This is supposed to be public Torah study as a group that we're all reading together. Why is this relevant? So what I want to do today is actually skip over the story of the birth of Yitzchak. Not that it isn't very relevant and important, but we only have time for so many things. And really look more carefully at the story of Hagar, and then also a little bit at the story of Abraham and Avimelech, because those are the two parts of the Torah reading that I think potentially seem unrelated. Although you could even argue, why was it that this story of Sara was chosen? There's lots of times that people's prayers were answered in the Torah that could have been the Torah reading for this day. So, there's what to be said about that. So what we're going to do now is we'll talk a little bit about Hagar. What's interesting about the story of Hagar and Ishmael, right? We'll look at it quickly inside. But what's interesting about this story is that this isn't the first time that Hagar sort of goes out to the desert and is approached by an angel and essentially saved by her experience in the desert. So what I'm going to actually do is take us, sorry for making you dizzy as I scroll, I'm going to take us to source number 3. If anybody wants this source sheet sent to them afterwards, I'm happy to email it to you. To the story, the first time Hagar was in the desert on her own and an angel found her. So let's look at that episode now and sort of see, and then we'll go back and read our Torah reading and sort of see if there are any similarities there and sort of see what we can learn from that. So we have this story, V'tikach Sarai eshet Avram, right? So Sarai, the beginning of this chapter, this happens earlier, right? This is before Ishmael was born. Sarai realizes she's not having children and she decides to give Hagar to her husband so that he can have children through Hagar as like a surrogate mother, essentially. And what happens is once Hagar gets pregnant, the dynamic between Sarah and Hagar is not a very healthy one. And Sarai complains to Avram and says, she's being disrespectful to me. And Avram in Pasuk Vav here, verse 6 is where I picked it up, responds to her and says, V'yomer Avram el Sarai, Avram says to Sarai, Hine shifchatech b'yadech, she's your slave, she's in your hands. Asi lahatov be'inayich, do whatever you want with her. V'ta'aneha Sarai v'tirach mipanea, and Sarai treated her harshly or treated her badly, and so she ran away. Whether she should have treated her that way or not treated her that way is discussed a lot in the commentaries, but we're going to leave that for now. V'yimtze'eha malach Hashem al ein hamayim, so an angel finds her on this spring of water, Bamidbar, in the desert, in the wilderness, al ha'ain b'derech shur. And V'yomer Hagar shifchat Sarai. He says, Hagar, the slave of Sarai, Amy zebat va'ana telchi, where are you coming from and where are you going? V'tomer, and she said, Mipnei Sarai gvirti anochi barachat. I'm running away from my master, my mistress Sarai. V'yomer la malach Hashem, and the angel of God says to her, Shuvi al gvirtech, go back to your mistress, v'hitani tachat yadeha, and you should be sort of submit yourself under her hand. V'yomer la malach Hashem, harbe arbe atzarech v'lo yisaper merov. He says, Hashem is going to, in the name of Hashem, he's basically saying, I'm going to give you a child, and that child is going to have many, many children. You won't even be able to count them. V'yomer la malach Hashem, hina chara v'yoladet ben v'krat shmo Yishmael. So he says, you're going to have a child, you're going to name him Ishmael. So then it tells us a little about Ishmael and what kind of a person he's going to be. And what's very interesting, just to hold on to for later, is she says in Yod Gimel 13, V'tikra Shem Hashem hadover aleha, she spoke out, she called out in the name of God who spoke to her. Ata kel ro'i, you are the God who saw me. Ki amra, hagam halom re'iti acharei ro'i. Because she said that you saw me, like I have not gone on seeing after he saw me. So there's something about vision here, about seeing. Al ken kara be'er l'chai ro'i, and therefore she called this well where she found this water, she called it be'er l'chai ro'i. I want you to just file that away for later, just to sort of. Sorry, I'm just trying to see everyone's faces at the same time that I am teaching. My husband is logged on.
How does it click on her face? How does it go on to
Oh, somebody's trying to get on the Zoom. Okay, so that is the first episode that we have of Hagar going out into the desert. She sees some water. She's stepped down by the angel. The angel says, you know, go back there, even though it's hard, go back. And I promise you're going to have many, many offspring and it's going to be good for you. And Hagar says, Hashem saw me, and she goes back. So that's that first episode. So now what we're going to do is look at the story of Hagar in our Torah reading, which is in chapter 21, Chaf Aleph, and we're going to see any sort of relationship there. Okay, so we are up to verse 9, Pasuk Tet. V'teres Sara et ben Hagar hamitzri, asher yodal Abraham mitzachek. Right, so Sara sees that the son of Hagar, right, which is Ishmael, who was promised to her during that first episode we just read about, that he is playing, making a mockery. There's obviously a lot we could discuss about what is it that Ishmael was doing wrong. But Tomer Avraham garesh ha'ama hazot be'et bana ki lo yirash ben ha'ama hazot al bni im Yitzchak. So she says to Abraham, you should chase him, you should banish them, get them out of here, because he can't be with my son. He cannot inherit with my son. And this is not good for Abraham. He's very uncomfortable with this idea. And then Hashem comes to him and he says, you know, listen to your wife. It says, Kol asher tomar lecha Sara shema b'kola. It's a good pasuk. My name is Sara. I should quote it more. And he ultimately does what Sara asked of him. And that's where we're going to pick up now. So Vayashkem Avram boker, Yud Dalet 14. We are in the English onto the next page, and in the Hebrew at the very bottom of this first page. Vayashkem Avraham boker. Avraham got up early in the morning. V'yikach lechem, and he takes bread, v'chemat mayim, and a skin of water. V'yiten al Hagar. He gives it to Hagar, Samal Shichma, and he puts it on her shoulder, Yeled, and the boy, so she goes out and she's sort of wandering in this wilderness, and he sends her out. And the Mefarshim there sort of talk about, was she lost? Did he give her enough water? Some say she lost her way, and if she would have gone the right way and gone straight to Beersheba, she would have made it to a hotel and she would have had enough water and food, but she ran out of water because she lost her way and didn't know where she was going. We'll talk a little bit more about that wandering next week when we compare her to Avraham, but that is sort of how she ends up in the desert. V'yichlu hamayim, the water runs out, min hachamet, v'tashlachet hayeled tachet achad hasichim. So she runs out of water and she sends the boy underneath a tree. Okay, how do I know sichim is a tree? I will bring you down here for a second. Here. At the very beginning of Bereshit, source number 5 here, Pasuk Hey. Before there was any sort of grasses or plants or trees, this is in the story of creation. So we see this word siach comes up the first time in the Torah. It refers to some kind of vegetation. So that's where we get this idea that he was cast under a tree. So she puts him under a tree, and what does she do? Sorry, just lost my spot. So she goes and she sits down from a distance, from the distance of like a bow shot, how far you could shoot a bow. So not super close, not so far. And she doesn't want to see him die. And so she sits for a rei, and she raises her voice and she cries. V'yishma Elokim et kol hana'ar, and God heard the voice of the boy. V'yikra malach Elokim el Hagar, and he calls out to Hagar, min hashemayim v'yomer la, malach Hagar, what is it? What's wrong, Hagar? Al tir'i, don't be afraid. Ki shema Elokim et el kol hana'ar ba'asher hu sham. God has heard the voice of the boy. Ba'asher hu sham, you could say where he is, and exactly where he is, the way that he is. So that's something I always notice when reading this Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah. The Asher Husham is there's a famous Rashi and a lot of other Mefarshim quoted as well. It's based on a Midrash. But Asher Husham, what does it mean where he is? Lafi hama'asim shehu oseh achshav hu nidon. He's going to be judged according to his actions now. The lo lafi ma shehu atid lasot, not based on what he will do in the future. This is from the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. Lafi shehayu malchei hasharet mekatrigim ve'omrim. Ribono shel olam, the angels in the heavens were going to Hashem and saying, Misha atid zaro lehamit banecha betzama, those who are going to, in the future, kill your children with thirst, atama alelo be'er, you're going to give him a well. So there's a whole story that happens later, and based on a verse in, I think it's Yeshayahu, where the children of Ishmael, the Jewish people are being brought into exile, and they stop there and ask for water while they're traveling, and the children of Ishmael don't give it to them, and they give them empty water skins, and the Jewish people die from trying to drink from these empty water skins. And the angels are saying, how can you save him and give him water now when you know that's what he's going to do in the future? And Hashem's response is, V'hu meshivam, he responded to them, Achshav mahu, what is he right now? A tzaddik or rasha? What is he right now? A tzaddik, a righteous person, or an evil person, or a wicked person? And based on that, the angels say, Amru lo tzaddik, he's righteous. Amar lahem, lafi ma'asav shel achshav ani dano. I'm going to judge him according to his actions right now. Now, this could work to our benefit or to our detriment, depending where we're at when we arrive at Rosh Hashanah. But there's something, I think, to me, sort of relieving in this concept that Hashem isn't going to judge us based on something that we haven't yet achieved or something that we haven't yet done. It's where we are right now. So it doesn't matter that the day after Yom Kippur, we're going to make mistakes. If we're doing our best to do tshuva now and to become, the best people we can be, then ultimately, that's how Hashem's going to judge us right now. It doesn't matter what's going to happen to us in the future. So that's just one sort of small Rosh Hashanah connection that comes up in here. But what I really want to point out from this verse is in the beginning of Yod Zayin 17, V'yishma Elokim et kol hana'ar. Who was it that raised their voice and cried in the previous verse? It was Hagar. But Hashem doesn't hear her voice. He hears the boy. So there's an implication that he too was crying, moaning, davening. It's not clear what, but Hashem heard him. He did not hear Hagar. And I think the implication in that is that Hagar in some way was doing something wrong. And what she's criticized for in a lot of the commentaries is the fact that she went and left her son under a tree and walked away. Instead of being with him in his pain, as difficult as that is, you can't imagine any mother whose child, chas v'shalom, is going through some sort of painful experience, leaving their child to deal with it on their own. A mother would want to be by their child, comforting them, telling them they love them, with them at that last moment. Even if it's terribly painful and unbearable for the mother, she would never just leave her child and move away and put her own pain in front of the child's pain. And I think that is the implication of Hashem saying, he's not responding to her, he's responding to him. And it's almost like she has to be heard and answered in his merit, but not because of her own actions. So that's just sort of something about Hagar I want you to sort of notice. So then we keep going. He says, don't be afraid. And Kumi se'i etanar in 18, get up, lift up the boy. V'hachaziki et yadeichbo, hold your hands, like hold him by the hand. Ki l'goy gedolos man, I'm going to make him into a great nation. V'yivkach Elokim et eineha, and God opened her eyes. V'tera be'er mayim, and she sees a well of water. V'telech v'titmelet hachemet, she goes and fills up the skin of water, the canteen basically. V'tashk et na'ar, and she gives him to drink. Okay? And then it says that he grew up and he married an Egyptian woman. Okay? So that is the end of this episode. And now Ishmael and Hagar, they've been saved. They're no longer in Abraham's home. They go off on their own way, and they are now separate from us. There isn't any indication in the text that where Hagar is now is the same place as she was the first time she went to the desert, but there's definitely a lot of parallels here. But what's interesting is the first time, it doesn't say that she couldn't find water. She was first encountered by the angel at the Ein HaMayim, at this spring of water. And in this case, she can't find water, and she gives up hope, and she leaves her son to die, and she walks away because she can't handle to watch it. She can't stand seeing it, and she sort of distances herself from him, and that is when Hashem finally intervenes and saves him. But I randomly stumbled upon a shir on YU Torah from actually an old teacher of my husband's when he was in yeshiva, Rav Usher Friedman, and he points out something that I thought was so interesting. It says that God opened her eyes, right? It doesn't say God created a miraculous well that just appeared out of nowhere. God opened her eyes, meaning the well of water was there all along. And it's not that Hagar needed some miraculous salvation. She just needed somebody to sort of give her a little nudge and tell her, look around. And he says, how should she have realized that it was possible there might be water around? How should she have not given up hope so quickly and thought to look around? Because she found a tree and she put Ishmael under a tree. And if you're in the desert and you see a tree, it doesn't mean there's for sure water right nearby, but the chances of there being some source of water somewhere in the vicinity is pretty high. And if she would have been willing to have some, hope in the possibility that God might help her out and lifted up her eyes and looked around, she may have seen it. And then she would have been able to save him on her own. But because she let go and gave up and totally disconnected from reality and just sort of shut down, left him under a tree and walked away, and it was basically just finished, God had to intervene and sort of open her eyes for her. And that sense of hope is something that she was clearly missing. Now, what Rav Asher Friedman pointed out, which I just thought was so amazing, is there's actually another connection in this story to something that happens much later, but it's really fascinating. So if you look back at the first episode of Hagar in the desert, at the end, she again speaks about God saw me. I saw that God saw me. There's this sort of connection to the idea of opening of eyes, of vision, of seeing, which is the opposite of what happened to Hagar when she was in the desert the second time. She shut her eyes. She couldn't see what was around her. She couldn't see the well. She needed God to open her eyes and show her. And when she is in the first episode, she calls the name of the well, right? She calls it Be'er Lachai Ro'i. That's what she refers to this well, okay? And it tells us it's between Kadesh and Bared. Then, if you look at this episode way later in Perek Chaf Dalet 24, this is the story of when Rivka is coming to meet Yitzchak for the first time, right? Abraham's servant went and found Rivka. She, again, with a be'er, with a well, her chesed shines through. She gets, chosen as the shidduch for Yitzchak, and she comes home on these camels, right? And she first encounters Yitzchak in the field. And famously, she falls off the camel, and there's all this discussion about how Yitzchak's sort of spirituality was shining through, and she had to cover her face because of his spirituality and how amazed she was and in awe she was of him. But what happens when she meets him for the first time? Let's read it inside. Okay, V'takam Rivka v'na'arotea. I'm at source 4, verse 61. Rivka and her maids arose. V'tirkavna al gmalim. They mounted the camels. V'tilachna acharei ha'ish. They followed after the servant. V'yikacha eved et Rivka v'ilech. And he took her and they went. V'yitzchak ba mibo be'er lachai ro'i. Yitzchak had just come back from going to be'er lachai ro'i. What's be'er lachai ro'i? It's the well that Hagar named when Hashem saved her or told her to go home to Sara's house the first time she was in the desert. So this can't be accidental. We don't know what Yitzchak was doing there, but suddenly the Torah is giving us this piece of information. It's almost saying, go back, look at this story of Hagar, pay attention, okay? Then what does it say next? V'hu yoshev be'eretz HaNegev, right? He lives in the Negev. V'yetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. In Samach Gimel 63, Yitzchak went out lasuach basadeh, to have a conversation in the field is usually how we translate that, lasuach from sicha. Usually we understand this to mean Yitzchak was out in the field davening, right? And he is the one who we learn about tefillah from. He's an extremely holy spiritual person. He's sort of outside of physical reality because of his experience of almost being sacrificed, and that he represents this spiritual force in the world, and he is davening in the field, right? He's having a little hitbodedut meditation time with Hashem. But what verb this is just so interesting to me, because the verb is lasuach. It didn't say lihit palel. It didn't say likro b'shem Hashem. It doesn't say anything like that. Those are lihit palel is to pray. Likro b'shem Hashem, to call out in God's name. That's often used in the context of Abraham in Sefer Bereshit. It says lasuach basadeh. It's almost like it's pointing us back to what word? The sichim, the siach, that Ishmael, the plant or tree that Ishmael was cast under when he was in the desert, that siach, it's almost like perhaps it even means, and I didn't have a chance to really look for this in the Mefarshim, but it doesn't mean he wasn't davening, but maybe there's some sort of double meaning here, that he was somehow with the trees, planting a tree, around the trees. He was in Be'er Lachai Ro'i, and then he went out Lasuach Basadeh. These words are clearly pointing us back to the story of Hagar. And that is, and what does Yitzchak do? He's davening to Hashem. Vayisa einav vayar. He lifts up his eyes and he sees. Yitzchak here is a foil to Hagar. Hagar needed someone else, Hashem, to come and intervene and open her eyes so that she could see what was going on. And Yitzchak, he just could see. He inherently had this hope. He had this ability to talk to God, to connect to God, and to see beyond. And I think this is really a message for Rosh Hashanah in a very deep way, right? That Rosh Hashanah is a day all about tefillot. It's all about davening and about our judgment for the coming year. And there is this sense of needing to have hope that things can be good, needing to have hope that you can merit this good judgment, that you can have bracha in your life, in your family's life, in your community. Otherwise, what are you davening for? If there's no hope, there's no point in davening. If you don't believe it's possible for God to do these things, why are you praying for them? You have to have hope. You have to be able to open your eyes and see the possibility of hope. And that's what Hagar was not able to do. And what Yitzchak clearly is the opposite of her. And we're supposed to be learning that idea, not to be acting like Hagar, but to be acting like Yitzchak. And I think that, this is just a small episode in the story of Yitzchak, and it's not really about his hope that much anyways, but just the little linguistic connections that you see to the Hagar story and the fact that he lifts up his eyes and sees, it's clearly pointing to us that Hagar missed something. And what she missed was the opportunity to lift her eyes and see. She missed the opportunity to see God in her life. And the first time around, she does sort of see him and she recognizes that he sees her. But the second time, she's in a dark place and you can't really blame her. She's just been kicked out of her house by a man who is the father of her child and sent into the desert. Either she wasn't given enough provisions, which hopefully is not the case. We can't imagine Abraham would do that. But more likely, the Mefarshim who say she got lost along the way and didn't make it to the hotel where she was supposed to go and ran out of water, ran out of food. She's there in the desert and she just feels like there's no hope. And she just shuts down, leaves her son, and just turns herself off. But the point is that there always is room for hope. Even when things seem extremely dark and extremely difficult, there is room for hope. And if Ishmael hadn't been promised to become a big nation, it's possible that her loss of hope would have just been the end of them. But because Hashem had made a promise, he had to intervene and literally open her eyes for her and help her see what was in front of her. So I just thought that was like a really beautiful message and a beautiful idea to sort of tap into when we think about Rosh Hashanah and sort of giving ourselves, we need to be ba'asher Husham. We have to judge ourselves and be honest with ourselves about where we're at and who we are and the state of our inner worlds as we walk into Rosh Hashanah. And we can't pretend everything is perfect if it's not. We need to work on ourselves, but we also need to have hope and we need to believe in ourselves and our ability to change. We need to believe in the ability for the world to change, of Hashem to make things better, and to be able to daven for that from a place of truly believing that Hashem really can do it, which we see, in the story of Sara being remembered at such an old age and having a child. That is a possibility. So I think that all of those stories sort of tie in. Then we still have this question. What is the deal with this story of Avimelech and why is it part of our Rosh Hashanah leaning? Like, it's just sort of so random, right? So we're going to look at it really quickly. I don't want to read every word for word inside so carefully, but I just want you to have a sense of what happens. And we will go from there into a couple of messages that maybe this is trying to give us in terms of Rosh Hashanah and why it might be part of the leaning. So I'm in verse 22 now, where it says, I wrote part 3, treaty with Avimelech. It's chafbet in Hebrew. Right? So right after Ishmael gets sent out, Yitzchak has been born. He's now 2 years old. He has this party when he's weaned at 2 years old, and then Ishmael gets sent out. And at this time, Avimelech and his chief of his troops, Pichol, come to Abraham, Lamor. Elokim imcha, God is with you, b'chol asher ata oseh, with everything that you do. Va'ata hishav'a li be'elokim. Now, please swear to me in the name of God. Hena im tishgor li v'lini v'lenechti. Please make a commitment that you will not deal falsely, you will not lie, you will not trick or fool or behave unfairly with myself or with my child or my grandchild. The chesed that, just like the chesed that I did with you, that he allowed him to live there. Do with me in the land in which I live, in the land in which you live. Okay, so Avimelech comes to Avram and he basically says, let's make a deal. Your kids and your grandchildren are going to treat my kids and my grandchildren fairly. And since I let you live here, that should be fine. So what happens? V'yomer Abraham, anochi yashavea. I promise, right? Abraham says, sure, I'm on. But then Abraham sort of takes a step back. V'hocheach Abraham et Avimelech. And Abraham, he gave him tochacha, right? He rebuked him, is usually how we would, reproached is this translation. We are now up to 25, or chafhei. Again, the Hebrew and English aren't quite in line. V'hocheach Abraham et Avimelech. He gave him some tochacha. Al odot be'er hamayin esher gazlu avdei Avimelech. Because there was a well of water that the children of Avimelech, the slaves of or servants of Avimelech had stolen. V'yomer Avimelech, lo yadati mi yasad et davar hazeh. I don't know who did this. V'gam ata lo higadati li, and you never told me about it. V'gam anochi lo shamati bilti hayom. I never heard about this until today. So he's sort of saying, it's not my fault, right? But v'yikach Abraham tzonu v'kar v'yiten la'Avimelech v'yichrotu shneihem brit. So Abraham takes cattle and they make a covenant. V'yitzev Abraham et sheva kvasot hatzon levadhen. He takes seven sheep and puts them aside. He keeps them separate. V'yomer Avimelech el Abraham mahena sheva kvasot ha'ela. What are these 7 female sheep? Asher hitzavta levadna, that you left on their own. V'yomer ki et sheva kvasot tikach miyadi. Ba'avor tihiya li le'eda ki chafarti et be'er hazot. He says, I want you to take these 7 sheep as a sign that you know that I'm the one who dug this well. Al ken karel makomahu be'er sheva. That's why it's called be'er sheva. Ki sham nishbeu shnehem. And this is why it's called be'er sheva, because that's where they made a shvuah, an oath to each other, or they swore to each other. Now, in the Mefarshim, they go on back and forth. Is the be'er sheva, is the sheva about 7 or about shvuah, an oath? And so that's sort of a discussion, not important for us right now, just something to notice. So this is why it's called be'er sheva. And then what happens next? Okay, v'yichrotu brit be'er Be'er-sheva v'yakam Avimelech. So they make this covenant in Be'er-sheva, and Avimelech u'pichol tzara'o, and Pichol, his chief of staff, get up. V'yeshuvu el eretz Plishtim, and they return to the land of Plishtim. V'yita eshel be'er-sheva, and Abraham plants a tree in Be'er-sheva. V'yikra sham b'shem Hashem kel olam, and he calls out in the name of God, the God of the world is maybe how it could be translated, although you'll see in a minute from Rav Hirsch, maybe that's not a good translation. Maybe it means the God of the future, or the God of always, the God of eternity. But Yagar Abraham be'eretz Plishtim yamim rabim. And Abraham lived there for a long time. And that is the end of our Torah reading. So a couple of things to sort of point out. First of all, what's really interesting, and maybe this is one first message, is that even Avimelech is able to sort of recognize that Abraham's gifts are from God. He says, I can see that God is with you, right? Right from the beginning, there is a recognition and an acknowledgement of God, that somehow being able to see that the bracha comes from God could be one potential message that we're supposed to be thinking about on Rosh Hashanah. You know, it's easier to remember in the context of Rosh Hashanah when you're standing there thinking about the judgment and who will live and who will die and who will, have children this year, and all of these decisions are being made. It's easy to recognize that the bracha is from Hashem. The question is, a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, do we still remember that it's all coming from God, or do we sort of lose sight of that and ultimately, sort of lose the ability, I would say, to recognize that in our lives? But even Avimelech, who wasn't Jewish, was able to see that. And so maybe that's one message. But I think what's even more interesting about what Avimelech says is, first of all, the context. It says, V'yihi be'ed hahi. So Avimelech seems to be recognizing that something is going on, that he needs to make a brit with Abraham now, because Abraham has now had this child with Sara. And the Mefarshim say that it must be that people knew that Abraham and Sarah were supposed to have a child, and this child was going to inherit from Abraham and sort of carry on this tradition. And he recognized, now that this boy is born and he's 2 years old and he's just been weaned, this is real. Ishmael's been sent out. It's clear this child is the child who's going to carry things on, and I better get on his good side now, because they're only going to get more powerful. They're going to grow into a great nation, and I want to be allies with these people. I don't want this family to be on my bad side. I want them on my good side. So I'm going to go make this covenant now. And the sort of proof of that, if we just scroll, all the way down, where is it? This is the source number 8 here, Bereshit Chaf Bet Aleph 22:1 is the very beginning of, it's the next verse. It's the very beginning of the second day's Torah reading, and it is the beginning of the story of the binding of Yitzchak, Akedat Yitzchak, V'yechi achar hadvarim ha'ela. It was after these things. It's like the text is saying that Akedah happens because of what happened right before. So the Mefarshim kind of go to town over this. What does that mean? So some say, oh no, it can't be that this treaty with Avimelech has anything to do with the Akedah. It must be, Hadvarim doesn't mean the things that happen, it means words that were spoken. Who spoke words? Oh, maybe it was the Satan who came and sort of challenged God, and then he forced God to go through with this Akedah. There's all these sort of midrashic ideas, but some really do read it as it's a response to what happened with Avimelech. And some read it as a punishment, that Abraham was wrong to have taken Yitzchak's future so sort of flippantly, to be willing to make an oath for future generations of his with somebody who maybe couldn't be trusted, and that was the wrong decision, and he shouldn't have done that. And because he was sort of so flippant about Yitzchak's future, Hashem sort of had to test that faith of Yitzchak's future. That's one opinion. But another opinion is that there's something about what happened in that exchange with Avimelech that made Abraham ready for his final test. I heard quoted from Rav Dessler, but I wasn't able to find it. Hopefully I will come across it, and if I do, I will share it with you. That he says that Abraham is generally known for his chesed, for him being he embodied kindness. And Sara was sort of the counterbalance to that, right? He couldn't see the bad in Ishmael. He didn't want to kick Ishmael out. Sara had to tell him he needed to. He needed someone to sort of show him and help him find the deen side of things, the judgment side of things. But in this conversation with Avimelech, on the one hand, he says right away, sure, I'll make a covenant with you. But in the next verse, I'm just trying to take us back there, he says right away, wait a second though, I need to tell you about something. Your servants stole my well. And if we're gonna make a covenant with each other, we've gotta be on the same page, and we've gotta be clear with each other, and we've gotta be honest with each other. And you can't be stealing from me, just like you don't want me stealing from you. And he actually overcame his natural inclination to be a chesed person, somebody who goes after peace, who doesn't like to engage in conflict. And he called him out because he recognized that that was necessary in this moment. And Rav Dessler says, because he was able to find that sort of deen inside of him, he was ready for the test of like true deen of this experience of being told to sacrifice his child. So that's sort of one approach. But what Rav Hirsch says, which is what I want to sort of finish off with, Rav Hirsch says a lot on this episode of Avimelech, and I really encourage you to read it. If anybody wants me to scan it and send them the whole thing, I'm happy to. I just cut out a few pieces, and we're not going to read all of them inside. But Rav Hirsch says that what is really going on here is this is all leading up to the story of the Akedah. It's almost like Yitzhak is born, Ishmael is kicked out, everything is finally working out. All these promises, right? From the moment that Hashem chose Abraham, and he started making him these promises, you're gonna have children as many as the sand, as many as the stars. And Abraham and Sarah's faith is continuously tested. Well, if that's true, where is our kid? Where is our kid? Where is our kid? And finally, Yitzchak is born, and everything is like finally working out for them. It's going the way it's supposed to go. Everything's wonderful. And now he's about to get to the Akedah. The reason the Akedah is an unbelievable test of his faith no matter what, because no one in their right mind would want to sacrifice their child. And nobody who has been sort of going around and preaching to everyone else that child sacrifice is wrong should be expected to sacrifice their child. But if you add to it the fact that Yitzchak is his child who was promised to him, who is supposed to have children, who hasn't yet gotten married and had children of his own, and he is suddenly being told he's going to die, how does this make sense? I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for this moment, and now you're taking it away from me. And this is sort of, this treaty with Avimelech is actually part of that buildup, because Avimelech coming to him, and this is this Rav Hirsch that I'm showing to you now, I'm not going to read inside, but he says, he's coming to him and he's saying, I've heard about this kid. I've heard he's going to be the one. And if the world is recognizing it, then obviously it must be the case that Yitzchak is the one. How could it be then that the next verse Hashem says, okay, now I want you to take him and go and kill him? It doesn't make any sense. And that's why it was such a test of Abraham's like willingness to follow after Hashem, because everything was pointing to the idea that Yitzchak was the one. He was the next generation. He was going to carry on this legacy. And even, you know, people from the outside world are coming and saying, let's make a covenant because Yitzchak's born. That means this is business. God's promise wasn't a joke. This is serious. I want us to be, you know, on the same team now. And all of a sudden it's being pulled away from him. And so perhaps, you know, it says at the bottom of this reference, if not for divine providence, the king and his general would never have turned to sending his 2-year-old son in order to establish such a covenant. For the political hopes of the old man and the boy would have been considered ridiculous. Here he's saying that Hashem sent him there. But why is he sending him there? Because Abraham gets this sort of boost in confidence when he meets with Avimelech, and Avimelech is saying, I know this son is going to be the one. So he feels even more sure and more confident in himself. But The other thing that Rav Hirsch sort of focuses on, and this is what I want to leave us with, is that at the very end of the episode, it would have made sense for the end to say, and Avimelech and Pichol went home. And then it would be the end of the chapter, and then Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'elav, and after these things, God tested Abraham, right? That would be the next verse. Why does it tell us that Abraham planted an Eshel, this tree that he planted, which Chazal understand to actually be Rashi Tevot, the initials for Achila, Shtia, and Lina, that he gave them food, water, and a place to sleep. He actually opened an inn as a way to do Hachnasat Orchim, to welcome guests, and that's what the Eshel really was, not a tree. But either way, he plants this Eshel, and then he calls out in the name of God, the God of the Olam. And Olam, we know, means hiddenness. We know that it means, it comes to mean world, but in the context of Tanakh, it doesn't really mean the word world. But Rav Hirsch points out that Chazal took it to mean world, and then they made it a part of our everyday sort of language of God, right? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam. We make brachos all day long. We're supposed to make 100 a day. We say Melech HaOlam over and over and over again. And Chazal took that sort of language, and it's coming from here where he calls him Kel HaOlam, the God of the Olam. So he says, what does Olam mean? He says it takes on the meaning of world, of this idea of concrete and actual reality. But it's really also means a sense of hiddenness and also something about future. I didn't give you, it was like a 3-page essay, but he talks about how Olam means future and this idea of time. And he says, why is this so important? He says, I'm looking at the second paragraph of the first little photograph here of the book. People commonly cope with distress by turning their thoughts to the future. By looking to the future, they seek solace for disconsolate present. Our sages did the opposite. Just when we had become a laughingstock to all the peoples in the world, our sages taught us to look upon every moment of the present as part of the future. They taught us to look upon thunder and lightning, upon blossoms, food, and tidings, upon everything that happens to us and all that we experience in the present, meaning we make brachot on all of these things, as part of eternity, and to recognize God as Melech HaOlam, who directs the hidden future as it gradually unfolds in the course of time. For every moment truly lived is of the essence of that eternity. It's not just about looking to the future and hoping for the future. It's about recognizing that my experience that I'm having right now is part of that future. Whatever I'm going through in this moment, be it positive, negative, it's part of this story of eternity that God is creating for us. And we are in that future right now. I always sort of joke, my 4-year-old, she always gets kind of confused and wakes up, and if she knows something's happening tomorrow, yesterday was her first day of school, so she'll say things like, is it tomorrow today? Right? Like, because if you tell her the day before, oh, tomorrow we're going to do this, so the next day she wants to know, is it tomorrow now? And she can't understand that now there's a new tomorrow. Tomorrow's the new tomorrow. Now today is today, right? But we're always in, today is related to tomorrow. We can't just look to the future. We have to see it in and of ourselves, right? Every moment truly lived is of the essence of that eternity, which we will ultimately share and can attain even in this life if we are what we ought to be. And this to me just jumped out at me as relating so well to the story of Hagar. Hagar couldn't open her eyes. She couldn't have hope. Whereas Yitzhak could have hope. He had open eyes. He was able to talk to God. He was able to daven for things. He was able to see the possibility of good in his life. And I think that Hagar, she was in a moment. She couldn't even hope for the future. But the irony of it was that the thing that could save her was right in front of her all along, and she just didn't look for it. It's not that the well was suddenly appeared. The well was right there. She just didn't see it. And her salvation, her future was there in that moment. She just didn't see it. And Hashem had to open her eyes to recognize that don't give up on this moment, because this moment is part of the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. And it all relates to each other. And you don't just need to have hope to the future. Hashem is Melech HaOlam. Hashem is the God of this hidden future, but he's also right here now. And that is sort of this message Rav Hirsch is giving us, that when Abraham finishes his interaction with Avimelech, he doesn't just go on with his life. He recognizes this is another piece, another sort of piece of the puzzle of my future. I'm going to call out to Kel Olam. I'm going to call out in the name of the God of the universe, God of eternity. And I'm going to make sure everybody else knows that as well. And that was sort of Abraham's mission. But that's also this message as we go into Rosh Hashanah and we're davening for our future, for our year, for a good judgment for ourselves, our family, and our community. We have to be able to have that hope. We have to be able to see that what I'm doing right now is going to impact my tomorrow. And what I'm, sort of working on right now is going to make me who I am the next day and the next day and the next day. And that's ultimately what it all sort of comes down to, if we don't have hope, we can't possibly daven for anything. And that's what Hagar missed. And that's really what Yitzhak sort of shows us by going back to that place. It's almost like he's doing a tikkun. He's correcting what Hagar did. He goes back to Be'er Lachai Ro'i. He goes back to that place to sort of reinfuse it with hope, reinfuse it with vision, and being able to see. And that's really what Abraham is teaching us as well. And perhaps that might be one reason why, instead of just cutting off the Torah reading at the end of the Hagar and Ishmael episode, we include this Avimelech episode as well, and it leads us directly into sort of part of the buildup of what Abraham is going to go through the next day. When we read the story of the Akedah, we can sort of feel the feelings of shock and confusion that Abraham must have felt. So we'll pick up next week with the second day reading, and we'll discuss the Akedah a little bit more and its connection to Rosh Hashanah. And yeah, that's it. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for being here. If anybody has any questions, I don't even know where the chat.
I just want to add that what you finished with was so special, because it's really, really what is today. Like, what is our Be'er Lachai Ro'i now? And I think now in our life, we can really see how COVID affected, that we all struggling with different things, and we have to hope, and we hope that we'll find the well, and the well will bring us to a good place. I think it's really affect also on more see the Rosh Hashanah for our days. Thank you so much. This is inspiring.
Thank you all for being here. I hope we can do it in person very soon, but in the meantime, I'm so glad we can be together and learn. It's so nice to see your faces, and everyone should just do well, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.